talked to him for like 20 minutes, and it was really fun. But Rob does a lot of research into this, and so I thought he'd maybe kick us off by just giving us some information about kind of how we're doing in terms of financing early stage companies.
All right. So I'm Rob, and I'm no smarter than anybody else in this room. This room's full of really, really smart people. I'm not sure exactly how to tear through some of this stuff, so I will just start making bald-faced assertions until you disagree. And then we can debate over numbers from there. I have sort of probably too much information, but a few things, I guess as a general thing, I tend to take a tough love approach to early stage finance. I hear a lot of complaining and all sorts of stuff all of the time. And my favorite metaphor in all of the early stage finance world is that John Wooden, who is the greatest college basketball coach of all time, won a lot of college championships, but the first 2 college championships he won at UCLA came in the women's intramural gym on UCLA's campus, not Pauley Pavilion, the palace that was built on all the success that he subsequently had. So you very rarely in the venture world get to build Pauley Pavilion before you win a couple of national titles. And I think sometimes in the venture world, a lot of entrepreneurs and a lot of companies that are working to move their way forward want Pauley Pavilion now, long before they've ever won a single title. So that's sort of a prior from me. I also want to echo your comments on customer cash. Each year in this country, about 600,000 or more companies are started. Regardless of the economy, it very rarely goes up or down, right? In a recession or not a recession, it's almost unmoved. In large part because I think entrepreneurs think it's a recession always. There's never a boon of resources sitting around for entrepreneurs, and so there's just not a big difference. Of those 600,000, about 3,000 get venture money. 3 out of 600,000. And about 20,000 or more get angel money, right? So there's about 575,000 companies that never get outside equity funding every year. That's the vast majority. Now, they still grow. 2/3 of all companies that go public never had venture capital money. Only 10% of the fastest growing firms in the country over the course of 5 years have any VC money at all. 90% of the companies have no VCs whatsoever. Many of them don't want VCs. And how do they fund themselves? And the answer is they sell stuff, right? And they produce net margin that funds growth.
Wait, that's pretty radical.
It's crazy. I understand. And clearly there are situations where people need capital. So I'm a professor at Willamette, and I'm also a partner in Motley Capital, a venture capital fund. And we know that companies need capital, and we like to fund the ones that we think that we can help grow. But not all companies need that kind of capital. So that's just sort of from a perspective standpoint. Equity financing is only a relatively small piece of a really, really, really large puzzle. And anytime I think about this, I always think about how do we get more customer margin to our companies first and foremost. Because nothing attracts equity financing more than customer margin. It's like all the credit card offers that you got after you no longer actually needed personal signature debt. That's just the way things come. Usually you get resources after you don't need them. A few things specific to Oregon. So I would also make an assertion that in Oregon, entrepreneurship's on the right trend, and that is over the last 15 years, I've been tracking the revenue and employment as a percentage of total in Oregon for a rolling 3-year window of companies. So basically it's revenue from new products, right? So if you think about Oregon as a company, how do you get revenue from your newer products so that you can complement the revenue from your older products? And that's been trending up. Over the last 15 years, it's improved systematically by about 5 percentage points as a percentage of total GDP or a percentage of total employment, which is really promising. Right now, that small group of rolling 3 years is about 15% of GDP, right, which is meaningful. So as we do policy for these early stage opportunities, they do aggregate to a huge impact, to echo your comment about microenterprise. It really does add up. But it's on the right trend. And a lot of the activities, and sort of policies that have come in have at least been encouraging that in some positive direction, which is a good thing. Another thing specific to Oregon, then, we like to compare ourselves to Washington a lot, as they're our neighbor. So I have some sort of a look at venture capital activity and performance, Oregon compared to Washington. And I tend to divide all the numbers by 3 to see if anything's actually different. I think sometimes we forget that Washington is a lot bigger than Oregon in terms of people and activity. And so it's about 3 times bigger. So I tend to divide by 3. If you look at the number of starts, you look at the number of ventures funded in Washington versus Oregon annually on average for the last 15 years, it's about 11 in Oregon, and it's about 40 in Washington. Each year get funded by VCs, give or take. So slightly better than 3 times, right? Which means Washington is definitely outperforming in terms of getting venture money into ventures. Additionally, the dollars they get are about $5 million more, at least $5 to $10 million more per venture that move into the Washington companies versus Oregon companies. So there's clearly, from an input standpoint, Washington's outperforming Oregon significantly. On the output side, interestingly enough, Oregon has about 5 acquisitions or IPOs on average each year to Washington's 15, which is right at 3. Which raises sort of a big concern that I have, which is as you push more stuff into these worlds, it doesn't always come out the other end. And oftentimes, in fact, the state with the lowest state estimate of cash-on-cash multiple to venture is California, right? It has the most money, it's pushing the most things around, and its return overall is the lowest of all of the sort of categories of states, in part because there's sort of a competition between the natural flow of entrepreneurship and entrepreneurial activity and our desire to just continue to add gas to it. So there is some natural limit on what we can accomplish and how we do that. So while Washington does outperform systematically on the in, it's not necessarily on the quantity of the outs outperforming Washington directly. Now, where it does is on the size of the outs. So over, let's see here, about 7 times more money has come back out from the Washington exits than the Oregon exits, right? So on quantity, it's about the same, but on quantity of dollars, cash, it's about 7 times larger than Oregon, which is a huge number. And to give you some perspective on absolute dollars, it is 12 billion versus, 14 billion versus 3 billion over the last 15 years of net cash provided back to investors, which usually gets flipped around back into angel investing and all the food chain sort of continues on, right? So from a VC standpoint, Washington is clearly in a stronger position when you look at that natural flow of capital. And while it's a useful goal to aspire to, we have to remember to sort of adjust for just the pure size difference between Oregon and Washington in terms of population. But that gives you at least some perspective on how that flow can work. And I hope to keep in mind the fact that it's not an unlimited flow of entrepreneurship and potential that you can just add water. Now, I'm not saying that adding more wouldn't necessarily help. I think that there are opportunities to do so. But there are natural limits to how much you can move things. One last other interesting, is this the last? Okay, 2 other interesting. Can I do 2 more, Jeremy? Is that quick? All right.
Yeah.
1, VC returns, so companies that are venture-backed and the systematic returns from them are completely indifferent to the state in which that company exists. So when you look at the valuation and the performance, company by company of venture-backed firms, it doesn't matter what state they're from, all the returns are comparable. So the fact that we have companies here in Oregon versus somewhere else means nothing, right? The returns are just as good as everywhere else. And if we can simply wrap our arms around and own that, we should be able to attract Poly Pavilion, right? We should be able to attract resources to us as a result of that simple fact. I was surprised by that fact. Simply because we oftentimes assert the presence of capital will lead us to better wins and better performance, and that data point does not suggest that that is in fact true.